So let's talk about why some competitive 40k tournaments are talking about banning Games Workshop's new faction of Space Dwarves. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about a rather interesting discussion that I've been reading over on the competitive 40k Reddit. Basically a bit of back and forth around some tournaments talking about not allowing the Leagues of Votann until Games Workshop have toned them down to the extent where they compete a bit better with the other armies and don't just annihilate the competition with railguns and judgment tokens. The OP for the Reddit post was mainly talking about a few German tournament organisers thinking about not allowing them in their tournaments, though it seems that there's at least a fair few other thoughts for other organisers around the world, and it's perhaps a reaction that hasn't been made to this sort of level for just about any other Games Workshop Codex release in recent history. As I'm sure plenty of people will be vaguely aware, the Leagues of Votann are up for pre-order at the moment, and they actually go on sale this Saturday. Currently they're not out yet, there's nothing to ban, no one has any Votann models en masse. It does seem though that anecdotally quite a lot of people are planning on jumping on the army box pretty hard when the box comes out. For a variety of different reasons, of course. I'm sure loads of people are just looking forward to collecting up-tuned squats in 40k. I think the army's aesthetic is pretty fun. Obviously not for everyone, but the same could be said of just about every 40k faction. But it does sound like there's been an inordinate amount of chatter for people around the competitive scene, expecting a whole ton of people to be buying up lots of the miniatures and then dominating at tournaments for a little bit until Games Workshop gets round to nerfing them. I have mentioned before in a few videos why the Leagues of Votann are seeming so strong. The Judgment tokens lend themselves to being about the most powerful damage output in 40k. The Almighty Land Fortress just seems to be a unit without any major weakness. Splash damage ignores invul railguns of doom, plus good range, toughness, and okay speed in a slow faction. On top of that, they've got great characters. Just about every unit in the small codex is strong. Their stratagem section is massively powerful, and their sub-faction rules seem very interesting as well, with a bunch of powerful and varied options. Admittedly, it does look like they're pretty low in speed, low in threat range, and have some underwhelming secondaries. But now people have been doing a serious amount of testing with them on things like Tabletop Simulator and just proxying the models in real life. The general consensus does seem to be that they are going to be problematically strong, and once the models are out, it does look like they could well be inserting themselves at the top of the tier of 40k armies, and go from a period of relative balance in 40k to having a new obvious strongest faction once more, where everyone else has to work around and try and counter them, as a lot of people will be likely running them. Obviously, it's still very early days yet, the codex isn't out, but I feel that the question of asking whether or not you should be banning potentially overpowered codexes at tournaments is a pretty interesting one, and I feel like a lot of people are going to have some strong feelings on either side. I thought it could be interesting to just run through a few positives and negatives of banning them or not doing so, and of course I'll be very interested to hear what you guys have to say down in the comments as to whether or not it might be sensible for tournament organisers to do so, at least until Games Workshop have had the chance to issue a balance patch if it seems that they do need them in practice. First up, let's go through a few potential positives of not allowing the codex in tournaments until that time. At the most basic level, 40k is at least a little bit more balanced than it has been previously right now. There's obviously still issues, but in general those issues aren't going to be made any better by a new and more powerful faction being the new strongest thing. That's going to make the game less enjoyable for most people for if you happen to be fighting them, and might not necessarily be good for the Leagues of Votann players either, as they're not going to be a popular army to play against if they're too strong. Expanding from that, first up, when the box first launches, there's going to be some unequal access to the faction. The release is starting off with a launch box, but not the codex and units individually, so only the people who can get their hands on the launch box will be able to run them at all. And even then, there's going to be a weird period where some of the units are out, but some of them don't have their plastic kits available. And it does seem kind of strange to be having them at top events if a lot of players can't really even get an effective army of them online yet. If they did go through a phase of being overpowered and crushing everything, it might make a bunch of big tournaments feel a bit cheapened, as I think nobody really wants the determining factor of winning or losing games to be what army you're playing, and it might just lead to a bunch of tournaments and events that you look back on and just think that they're kind of pointless, and they were dominated by the Leagues of Votann winning everything. By having a bit of backlash against Games Workshop releasing unbalanced armies, it might well create a bit of pressure on them to actually make things a bit more balanced at release. I have a feeling that if this sort of sentiment gets widespread, then it might well prompt some fairly swift change. I think GW want these to sell as well as possible, which is partly some of the motivation for the strong rules, but if there's a whole load of negativity around them due to them being overpowered, then that might actually hurt their sales. Next up, a temporary ban might not really need to last all that long. Potentially you could just have it until the first FAQ after the codex, just to make sure that Games Workshop didn't want to make any obvious changes that weren't working as intended. Broadly speaking, most of the intent of the rules of the book does seem pretty clear, but it's not unheard of them to change a few important things a few weeks after the codex drops, though otherwise we might well be waiting for the next balance pass or FAQ. Finally, I think you could argue that banning them at some events might not necessarily hurt that many players. I suspect the majority of people it will affect are people who rush out to get an entire army of them painted up, perhaps more so to take advantage of big rules rather than just running them for fun and for love of the faction. And I've got no doubt that most events would want them to be run unrestricted as soon as possible, just provided they're not absolutely dominating and making the event overall a bit more depressing. Moving on to the flip side though, I can see quite a lot of people not being particularly happy with this, perhaps for a variety of different reasons, and partly perhaps just because it feels a bit unprecedented within 40k tournament communities. First up, I think you could say that they might still not be quite as bad as they look. Certainly on paper the damage output is scary, but maybe they will just be countered hard by certain armies in the game, though at the moment it just really doesn't seem all that likely to me. Even if they do have a couple of bad matchups, it might not stop them being horrifically oppressive to a whole ton of armies. Certainly it seems like, say, Imperial Knights with the Judgment tokens might well get absolutely demolished if they're running any big knights along. Still though, if people's initial takes are just completely wrong, then it might just be very unnecessary. I think one thing that does stick out a bit more though is that it does feel that these might be being treated very differently to other armies in 9th edition. So far in game balance terms, 9th edition just really hasn't been very good at all, and I honestly wouldn't be too surprised if the Leagues of Votann weren't any more powerful than say Tyranid, Harlequins, Admech or Drakari when their codexes first came out and they absolutely dominated for a bit. It does just seem a bit weird that just because they're a new faction people just say no, we're not playing with the Leagues of Votann at all. Perhaps just because they know that nobody's got an established army of these yet, so you're not going to annoy all those players who have had the faction for ages and are going to be very annoyed at not being able to use it when they get strong. Next up, I feel like banning people's fun new miniatures at tournaments is a bit of a feels bad move. For people who have been looking forward to the release and playing with events at them, even if they're not particularly top flight cutthroat competitive players or anything, it could still be a bit sad to say that you've put a whole load of time and effort into these new models and now you can't even turn up if you want to. On the flip side of events feeling cheapened because they do include an overpowered army, you might argue that they could also feel cheapened because they're not trying to take down the strongest stuff around. It seems like a lot of people wouldn't be against not allowing them in until they've proven that they're not going to ruin things, but I feel there's quite a lot of people who might have the attitude of yes, sure, we want to try and take down the strong space dwarves. They might need nerfing in time, but in the meantime we'll do our best and try and go for a bit more of an adapt and overcome approach as opposed to just ignoring them. You could maybe argue that imposing some sort of arbitrary handicap could be okay in the meantime, rather than banning them outright. Maybe just say that you can only take 1800 points at a 2000 point game or something like that. I guess people might argue every which way as to whether or not that's appropriate or exactly where the arbitrary line should be drawn. But if you really did feel that a faction was too strong for 40k, that would seem like a pretty reasonable way to just draw them back into line, rather than choosing to ban them outright if it did come to that sort of level. And in any case, since the balanced data slates have been coming out, Games Workshop have tended to be a bit more prompt with addressing problem factions. Usually they get hit by nerfs within a couple of months anyway, so maybe a ban just isn't really all that necessary just to cover that time. A few people were raising the point that having tournament feedback and clearly them dominating everything might well be the clearest indication to Games Workshop that they need to rein them in. But to be fair, I'm not sure it's going to be that big of an issue. I'm sure while some events will say no to them, at least a fair few will probably still let them in. Finally, if you do anger the space dwarves, they might well just write your name in the book of grudges, always something to bear in mind. So I'll be interested to hear what you guys think. What do you reckon to the idea of tournaments banning Leagues of Votann until Games Workshop have had the chance to issue an FAQ or balance patch if necessary? Is it too much too soon? Or is it a sensible step in the meantime to keep the game playable before some inevitable readjustments? It certainly seemed that in general on that Reddit thread, the consensus seemed to be that it was a pretty reasonable thing within competitive 40k, though there were plenty of comments that voiced the opposite opinion. I'll be interested to hear your guys' thoughts. Would you be for this or against this? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, while I certainly keep the regular 40k content coming. I do tend to post new things just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well. It's this that allows me to keep the 40k content coming quite so regularly, so if you are enjoying quite a bit, then any support is massively appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.